Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video in the extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I know I've already done an extra video today where I was giving you a bit of an analysis of some data presented by a viewer in the form of an Excel spreadsheet. Go and check that out. That's a gift from us to you. So that you can check that data out and analyze all of the lovely graphs and data points for the Russian losses over the course of the war. But nonetheless, I'm going to do another of my normal extra videos, and let's get right into it. We are going to start with a BBC article, decent BBC article, saying, why are people leaving Russia? Who are they? And where are they going? This is a question that many people have been wanting to answer, given that there could be some serious repercussions from Russian migration leaving Russia as a result of the war, the brain drain that might have, the economic impact of skilled working age people leaving Russia. Well, it talks, this article brings to the fore a number of different accounts from differing people. Starts with Svetlana, but I'm actually going to join it a little bit later just on some of the analysis. Russians have been leaving even before the Ukraine war, including those who disagreed with Moscow's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and with new laws that made it easier to punish dissent. Also, this is me as an aside, and actually it talks about it later in the article, when you have laws clamping down on LGBT communities and people arguing for human rights in lots of different sectors, you know, those kind of that liberal type of person, as Putin goes towards a fervent nationalist extreme, there are going to be different groups of people who don't conform to his idea of, Russianness and his idea of national identity. Anyone who doesn't fit that mold, you're going to be wanting to get out of there. So there'll be a number of different reasons why people might want to be leaving Russia in general. Many settled in the Baltic states and other EU countries, as well as in Georgia. For Svetlana, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was a turning point. Quote, when the war started, I realized that it would not be over soon, and also that people would not come out to protest. I felt both emotionally and rationally it made sense to leave, she says. She's now in Belgrade, Serbia's capital. I wanted to put as great a distance between myself and the authorities as possible. Many Russians share her feelings. And what had been a trickle turned into a stream. The first wave came in March and April last year. New emigres told the BBC that they were against the war, and disappointed more Russians did not come out to protest. Feeling isolated and at risk, they felt it was safer to leave. And then the second wave was a result of mobilization, different stages of mobilization, where people were getting out because they didn't want to end up being on the front line. Now, you can argue that this was a different type of emigration, where the first people were more in principle against the war. These people aren't necessarily against the war who were escaping mobilization, but they were against dying, right? So it's to some degree self-preservation. So here it said men and their families started leaving in droves, creating days-long queues on the Russian borders with Georgia and Kazakhstan. So arguably a lot more men in that second wave to escape the draft. How many left and where to? So there are no exact figures on how many people have left Russia, but estimates vary from hundreds of thousands to several million. In May, the UK Ministry of Defence estimated 1.3 million people leaving Russia in 2022. Other estimates of figures from various sources confirm the trend. Forbes magazine cited sources inside the Russian authorities as saying that between 600,000 and 1 million people left in 2022. The Bell and RTVI, popular Russian language media, publish comparable figures. So if we look at this graph, this is Russian citizens' requests for asylum in the European Union. Back in January, I don't know what happened at the beginning of 2020, but there's obviously something, and then that tailed off. It's fairly consistent, and then as the war started, it doubled. So Russian asylum seekers doubled in their applications. That then didn't so much tail off as plateaued somewhat, and then a massive increase took place and still appears to be continuing as a result of the mobilization efforts of the Russian military. So leaving Russia is relatively easy as long as you have money and have not been called up to the army. But finding a permanent place to stay is hard. In the months following the start of the war, many countries, mostly the EU and the US, made it difficult for Russians to apply for visas unless they already had family there or were traveling to work. In many other countries, such as Georgia and Armenia, Russians faced no such restrictions and could come and go as they please. They still can. Other countries, including Kazakhstan, changed their laws earlier this year, reportedly to stem the flow of Russian migrants by limiting how many days they can stay as tourists. Indeed, some of the Baltic states have made it illegal for Russians to come in. Essentially, they fear that that mix of people who are, as I mentioned, aren't necessarily anti the war, so they could still be staunchly pro-Russian in or pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin in their politics. You don't want them suddenly turning up and living semi-permanently in the Baltic states. Um, Without a prospect of returning to Russia, more and more people need to apply for residency to be able to work in the countries they are settling in, though many are finding ways to keep work remotely for Russian employers, keep working remotely. We know that in the past 15 months, around 155,000 Russians received temporary residence permits. Collectively, EU countries and several countries of the Balkans, Caucasus, and Central Asia. Nearly 17,000 have applied for political asylum in EU countries, but only around 2,000 have received it, according to the European Union Agency for Asylum. The Russian Interior Ministry says 40% have applied for foreign passports in 2022 than in the year before, 40% more. Sorry. So that is a significant uptick there. Now, I talked to you about certain people might have different reasons. It talks about a gay Russian here who was seeking asylum, moved to Sweden and wanted to seek asylum, but had that turned down, is now sort of getting legal advice to do that. Sociologists studying the current Russian emigration say there is evidence that those leaving are younger, better educated, and wealthier than those staying. More often, they are from bigger cities. Um, talks about that person I was just mentioning. Now, I've talked about in a previous video there being different sort of moral arguments to do with this. Where is it right for certain countries to say no to these people if they are genuinely getting out to the fearing for their lives, being sent to the front line, or should you kind of say no? That's what your government wants. If you're not against the war, you should go back and be a part of that. Whereas that might be slightly different. Those people might be slightly different from people who are genuinely against the war, genuinely political asylum seekers. They're against the Kremlin, against Putin, but fear for their lives if they've already publicly shown dissent for the government or would want to do that. But if they do, then they'll end up in Russian prison, so on and so forth. What does this mean for Russia? The Russian authorities tried to downplay the impact of hundreds of thousands of educated and well-off people leaving the country along with their money, but the economic impact is evident. Russia's largest private bank, Alpha Bank, estimates that 1.5% of Russia's entire workforce may have left the country. Most of those left are highly skilled professionals. Most of those who left are highly skilled professionals. Companies complain of staff shortages and hiring difficulties. Russia's central bank reported in the early stages of the war that Russians withdrew a record 1.2 trillion rubles, around 12 billion pounds, $15 billion, from their accounts. This is a scale unseen in Russia since the 2008 financial crisis. Economist Sergei Smirnov from the Russian National Academy of Sciences believes that, as a general trend, higher skilled individuals will continue to look for ways to leave. There will be increasingly more demand, he says, for people to be able to fix cars or make shoes. I don't like apocalyptic scenarios, but I believe this will lead to productivity within the Russian economy continuing to fall over time. The Economist points out that these trends will primarily affect large cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Yekaterinburg. Quote, most of the Russian territory will not be aware of these transformations because standards of living in smaller cities, towns, and villages have always been low and will continue to be in the future. There's a difference then as to how this will affect Russia, depending on where you are talking about inside Russia. It might disproportionately affect Moscow and St. Petersburg and other metropolitan centers like that. That is a little bit of an insight into the issue. There, I have. I did it was months and months ago. Actually, I did a little bit of analysis on this and how certain particularly skilled areas. There was some, I forget the exact job, but there was some guy running a factory that needed sort of three of these particular type of workers, and it wasn't so much about the people who had left, but the people who'd been drafted into the military. And he's like, I've only got one out of the three people who can do that job, and it's really I can't just advertise for that job and get someone. It's a really particular skill set, and two of my three people doing that job here are now fighting on the front line. Who knows? They're probably dead by now. But it's not just the emigration that's causing economic issues, but actually the drafting itself. Right. Connected to this is Chris Owicki's thread. So a single district in the Novosibirsk region. So the Novosibirsk region is quite far over to the east of Russia, just northeast of Kazakhstan. You can see the Black Sea there, Azov Sea, Ukraine. So we're going quite a long way to Novosibirsk. So, a single district in the Novosibirsk region is reported to have sent nearly 4% of its entire population to the Ukraine war. Just give you an understanding of what 4% is, because I know some of you might struggle with your maths. 4% is 4 in 100 people. Now, I always think about, right, if I go into work and there's 100 people at work in a big office I work at or something like that, I don't, I work from home, there's an office of one. If I go to work and there's 100 people and four of them have gone to the war, then that gives me a sense of trying to work out that percentages. I know it's really simple, but I like to think that in real terms, or 100 people I might see in a day when I go out to shops, like four of them weren't there. It doesn't sound huge, but when you talk about an entire region, that is really quite significant. A single district in the Novosibirsk region is reported to have sent 4% of its entire population to the Ukraine war. Its former head is said to have mobilized anyone, quote, who crossed her path. Angry residents smeared her car with feces in protest. The Susan district of the Siberian region of Novosibirsk has a population of around 31,000 people. According to her local residents, around 1,200 people, 3.9% of the entire population, probably amounting to around 7.5 or 8% of the male population, were mobilized. The entire Novosibirsk region, with a population of 2.8 million people, is reported to have mobilized around 11,500 people. Those mobilized from this one small district, therefore equal around 10% of those mobilized from the entire region. The pace of mobilization from Susan was frantic. There were so many that they could not even be accommodated in the largest mobilization base in Siberia, but had to sleep in a recreation center instead. Even men over 50 who were supposed to be exempt were not spared. A local says, quote, 5 buses with the mobilized people were sent on the very first day. Then they sent them every day for a week, but there were already fewer buses available. The massive scale of the local mobilization is being blamed on the former district head, Lilia Nekrasova, who has since been arrested on corruption charges, and Vasily Radev, the notably belligerent head of the Suzan Military Registration and Enlistment Office. In a recent speech at the 9th of May Victory Day commemorations, Radev told Suzan residents, quote, "Today the Nazi underdogs are raising their heads. They are being fed by the Anglo-Saxons who are dreaming of getting their hands on our resources. We will not allow this to happen, and once again we will free all mankind from Nazism. Once again, happy holidays to you." That sounds like a bundle of joy. Local people say Nekrasova personally selected who was to be mobilized. She is said to have spent nights studying men's personal files and pointing her finger at who to take away. If someone crosses her path, he's already gone to war. This made her very unpopular. After the first batch of Mobics was sent, angry locals are said to have repeatedly poured feces over her car. It was effed up. They smeared sugar, honey, ice, and tea all over her car every night, says a Novosibirsk politician. Although some Susan residents voiced concern to the local media, they decided not to record a protest video because they were afraid of Nekrasova. Many were afraid to talk about it, even anonymously. Nekrasova had a reputation as someone who, quote, wanted to curry favor with her superiors and as, quote, a very active woman compared to previous leaders. End quote. She regularly wrote on Telegram about her visits to the mobilized and claimed she had ensured they were provided for. However, relatives say that they had to buy uniforms for the guys ourselves and send them by mail. One woman says she spends 50,000 rubles, $618 a month to send provision to her husband as, quote, this is the only way to deliver at least something to our guys. Nekrasova was arrested in October 2022 and charged with fraud for her husband's fictitious employment in municipal institutions and in the construction of a sewage treatment plan. She was removed from her position and is now under house arrest. Meanwhile, the Mobics are trickling back to Suzanne, both on leave and in coffins. They are only being allowed to take leave in groups because their commanders fear that they won't return if they go individually. Quote, they are intimidated by collective responsibility. This many went on holiday, that many have to come back, one wife says. The commanders say, if you don't come back, we won't let anyone else go. The coffins of dead Mobics from Suzanne have also been arriving regularly since January 2023. The local cultural centre hosts ceremonies for the dead before they are transported to cemeteries in their native villages, with funerals paid for by local roads department. Suzanne is preparing itself for more funerals, many more funerals. Its inhabitants are no strangers to mass fatalities in wartime. During World War II, 9,105 Suzanne residents were sent to the front, and 4,222 of them, nearly half of the total, were killed. Local officials are invoking this legacy of sacrifice for the motherland to obtain support and claim legitimacy for the war in Ukraine. The current district head, Gorshkov, told residents on the 9th of May, quote, today participants in a special military operation are presently in action. Our dear defenders, you are defending what our fathers, grandfathers and great-grandfathers fought for. It's weird when you say you are defending by sending troops out to invade another country that appears to be kind of more progressive, more liberal, more free than you are. I mean, what are you defending? Bizarre. But anyway, that is one particular region that seems to be sacrificing more than others. Now let's go for something a little bit off the beaten track. Now, this may be frivolous, it may be ridiculous, it may be highly controversial. I'm wondering what you think about this. Does Putin have a body double? Probably has a body double. Does he have a face double? Like, is there an argument that sometimes that's not actually Putin that we see in public? I don't know. You see so many memes. You look at this one. Is Putin using a body double? If you look at these two images side by side, you'll see that he looks completely different. I guess there are at least 3, maybe 4 body doubles in use, says this person. I mean, that is completely different. Is he just on steroids here? I mean, Tony Blair's, he looks really, Tony Blair's, he almost looks Chinese now. It's weird. But Putin definitely looks very different. Is that just aging? As I say, steroids from being ill with some kind of illness. Does that explain all of this? But there are so many memes kicking around, and honestly, a good proportion of it's going to be complete nonsense, right? But there's some part of me that just thinks, well, are some of these images like different people? They kind of look fairly different when you look at some of these older ones, particularly the older ones. We'll come on to some comparisons soon of these, and then some people have done analyses that try to indicate that they are sort of different people in these different images. I don't know. I'm probably not astute enough to recognize. Then other people say, no, ridiculous. Look, I've done an analysis of these two images and they are the same person. You might think they look different, but he's got a mole there, he's got this and that. And then you look at things like this. So this is one, I did have this in English somewhere, but I just can't find it at the moment. So this is the Russian version. But what this says on the left up here, it says round-faced, swollen doppelganger appears most often on TV. So this is your main TV one. Square-faced, sullen double often replaces the swollen one. And then we have the real Putin who disappeared in 2011. So there's the idea, but this is actually where I think this guy does look a little bit different, really, to the ones above. I honestly can see that this is perhaps a slight category of difference to the other Putins. And then we have the more masculine counterpart of Putin who rarely appeared in the frame. And actually, these, I would say that does look like a different person. I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know whether this is just fanciful nonsense, and it could well be. But do you see a difference between any of these Putins. I think these top Putins, the more modern Putin that we see now, does seem to be a little different from some of the older Putins, but then hairline's fairly similar. Some of the other indications would be that they are the same person. He's just maybe, I don't know. Has he had Botox? Has he had just is he on a lot of steroids? Does that explain everything? I guess we shall see. I mean, some of these the headlines are even further back then, possibly. I don't know. I don't know. What do you reckon? Answers on a postcard. Are we always seeing the same Putin, or are there body doubles? So now we're going to go on to a thread by Timothy Milovanov, and this is, he says, David Sachs misinterpreted John Mearsheimer, who misinterpreted the history and Ukraine, and Twitter went wild. Okay, what's he referring to? So first of all, who's John Mearsheimer? He is an American political scientist and international relations scholar who has been fairly controversial. Some people really vehemently disagree. Some people really agree with what he says over Russia and Ukraine and Crimea. He's had he's cast his opinions on this for a long time now, warning back in 1993 that a nuclear-free Ukraine would remain exposed to the danger of Russian attempts at reconquest, which I think is absolutely right. But he's been a little bit more controversial since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. In his 25th September 2015 lecture, Why is Ukraine the West's Fault? Mearsheimer stated the West, the United States and the EU, was leading Ukraine down a primrose path, that the Western powers were encouraging Ukraine to become part of the West despite their hesitancy to integrate Ukraine into NATO and the EU, and they were encouraging the Ukrainian government to pursue a hardline policy towards Russia, and that the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. In the same lecture, Mearsheimer declared, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is to encourage it to try to conquer Ukraine. Putin is too smart to try that. Interesting. Anyway, he's pretty controversial and has been continuing to say stuff that doesn't really sit well with allies of Ukraine and with Ukraine itself. Anyway, he's said some stuff, and David Sachs has got involved. Who's David Sachs? He's an entrepreneur, author, investor in internet technology. I think he might be one of the founding CEOs of PayPal, along with your man Elon Musk. In fact, he's got investments in SpaceX as well, so probably fairly connected to him. He's also born in South Africa as well, so Elon Musk. So I think there are some connections there. And he's politically speaking, he's given money to Ron DeSantis's campaign, so a pretty staunch Republican as well there. No, just give you an idea. That's what happened is David Sachs says, important recent talk by Mearsheimer. I mean, look at what people are saying about this. That beautiful intersection between political BSer Mearsheimer and techno watermelon, David Sachs. So a lot of people don't like these two. And then here's someone saying, not sure whether to laugh harder at Sachs trusting Mearsheimer, who was one of the wrongest pundits leading up to the war in Ukraine, or at Mearsheimer, whose analysis implies he pulled Rip Van Winkle from February 22 to the present and doesn't know what happened militarily since then. I mean, there is this accusation that he just hasn't got a clue what's going on, Mearsheimer. And Mearsheimer, to me, I don't know a great deal about him and about his claims. I mean, I've seen a few of his talks sometime back now, actually. And I get the impression that he's one of these people who occasionally says some quite interesting and decent things, but then also says an awful lot of highly contentious claptrap that then overshadows the BS, overshadows the good stuff that he might have said. And just to call into question the original claim of how accurate Mearsheimer has been, John Mearsheimer, February 15th, 2022, the Russians are doing very well for themselves, and I don't think they're going to invade. February 24th, Russia invades Ukraine. David Sachs, 2023, Mearsheimer's predictions about the conflict have been highly accurate. I mean, he got literally the biggest prediction wrong. But anyway, David Sachs says, important recent talk by Mearsheimer on current status of Ukraine war and what's likely to happen next. Mearsheimer is the leading scholar of international relations, and his predictions about the conflict have been highly accurate going back a decade. And this is the sort of stuff that Timothy Milovanov is going to call out. Key points. One, current the Russians are winning the war. Ukraine had the upper hand in 2022, but Russia has it in 2023. Hmm. The Russians have not won yet, but Mearsheimer believes that they are winning and they will win. Why? This is a war of attrition similar to World War One. The goal is to bleed out the other side. This is a Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier standing toe to toe and beating the hell out of each other in the center of the ring. Who wins a war of attrition? Three factors decide. One, balance of resolve. Both sides are resolved. Two, population. Three, artillery. Russia has 3.5 to 1 population advantage at the beginning of the war. This has grown to about 5 to 1 as a result of 8+ million Ukrainian refugees, 3 million of which have gone to Russia. Artillery is the king of the battle. Balance of artillery is somewhere between 5 to 1 and 10 to 1 in Russia's favor. Is it still? The US doesn't have enough artillery to give Ukraine that's why we're talking about tanks and planes. Two armies standing toe to toe trying to destroy each other with firepower. Russia has a lot more men and artillery. Casualty exchange ratio is at least 2 to 1, meaning that 2 Ukrainians are likely dying for every Russian. The Ukrainians' claim of 7 to 1 CER in their favor is ludicrous. The Russians are not doing mindless frontal assaults. A recent RUSI report shows that Russian tactics have improved. Yep, in some places. And have you read that report closely? Ukraine pushed large numbers of troops into Bakhmut in a losing effort. Ukrainians are becoming desperate to conscript men. Russia has not fully mobilized yet. I mean, all of this is highly, highly dubious. Two, what's likely to happen next? Russia will take the 4 oblasts they already annexed, plus, if they can, another 4 oblasts of the Dnipro River, including Odessa and Kharkiv. The goal would be to bring all the ethnic Russians under their control to avoid another Donbass problem. Russia doesn't want to take Western Ukraine. Trying to conquer ethnic Ukrainians, who hate them, would be like trying to swallow a porcupine. But their goal is to turn Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state so it can't threaten them or be used as a Western bulwark on their border. There's not going to be a peace agreement. Best case is a frozen conflict. Why? 1, the parties can't agree on territory. 2, they can't agree on neutrality. 3, hyper-nationalism. Hatred on both sides makes a deal impossible. 4, no trust. Western leaders and Zelensky admitted that they had no intention of honouring the Minsk agreements and entered them just to buy time. Some of those points are actually fairly sound. George Kennan George Kennan, Bill Perry, Jack Matlock, and General Shalikashvili said that NATO expansion was a prescription for disaster. They were right. It's only going to get worse. Mearsheimer hopes to be wrong about this, but this is his prediction. F-16s won't make a difference because it takes a long time to train good pilots. Also, the Russians have very good air defense and their own air forces ready to engage. Biggest risk of F-16s is that Ukraine uses them and attacks targets inside of Russia, creating an escalation which could draw the US deeper into the war. Mearsheimer believes that if the Russians are losing the war, the likelihood of nuclear use to rescue the situation is high. The war is existential for the Russians. That's ridiculous. So if the Russians are winning the war, can't do anything, let Russians have what they want. If the Russians are losing the war, don't allow the Ukrainians to win because the Russians will use nuclear. In other words, no matter what, Russians get what they want. This is his approach, and I would love to sit down with this guy and just tell him what for. The war is existential for the Russians, but as it stands now, the odds of nuclear use are very low because the Russians are winning. Right. So this is what Milovanov says to that. And this kind of stuff needs to be taken to pieces. So 1, the Russians are winning the war. Ukraine had the upper hand in 2022, but Russia has it in 2023. Actually, the 2023-22 comparison is wrong. Even after the battles of Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Kherson were lost, Russia had more territorial gains in 2023 than in 2022. I think he actually means Russia's had more territorial gains in 2022 than in 2023. In 2023, the Russia mobilization has produced no result. The number of casualties doubled, and there is chaos and infighting within the Russian military leadership. All of this was exchanged for gaining a small, non-strategic city of Bakhmut, but even that is contested. I mean, it still is contested. Now recall Belgorod, Crimea attacks, Black Sea fleet problems, drones all over Moscow, continuous long-range attacks in Russian territory, gas embargo, oil price ceiling, primary and secondary sanctions, Russian fiscal challenges, international isolation, firmer support for Ukraine, F-16s, tanks, storm shadows. How is Russia winning? This is a war of attrition. 3 factors decide. 1, balance of resolve. Both sides are resolved. 2, population. 3, artillery. Okay, let's start with the resolve. In Ukraine, the entire population has resolved. In Russia, the Kremlin and even then, not everyone. We have seen Russian power structures crumble and fast in the past. You can never predict when, but Russia can fold at any moment, and if it does, it will be spectacular. Everyone will abandon the ship, maneuvering for the post-war power play. 3. Russia had a 3.5 to 1 population. This has grown to about 5 to 1 as a result of 8+ million Ukrainian refugees. This is a valid argument. Russia is much bigger and has more people, but that's exactly its weakness. It is an empire and it has suppressed its people for long. Recall the end of the Soviet Union. Everyone fought with everyone in Russia. There was no love lost between different regions. Moscow doesn't care about Belgorod, and Belgorod hates Moscow. You can try to mobilize all of these people for a war of an unclear purpose. Do this, and you will end up thrown out of power. The war in Ukraine is all games and fun for most of the Russians, as long as they don't have to pay the cost themselves. We do not see people resisting en masse in Belgorod and raising to protect their cities and villages. That's very different from Ukraine, where every village resisted. So yes, there are more people in Russia, but their morale is low, training is inadequate, and they will sooner fight each other than unite and be willing to die in the name of Putin. Point number four, artillery is the king of the battle. Balance of artillery is somewhere between 5 to 1 and 10 to 1 in Russia's favor. The US doesn't have enough artillery to give Ukraine. Every statement here is problematic. It's true that artillery is critical, but precise artillery is even more important. The West has precision, Russia doesn't. I mean, this is... Do your homework, mate. I mean, HIMARS versus an old D-20 howitzer. It's also true that Russia has more artillery than Ukraine, but does it work? It might come as a surprise to people like John or David that artillery barrels have limited lifetime. They've been buying artillery barrels off Iran. That's how desperate they are. The Russians were shooting at a rate of 20 to 50,000 per day. This definitely put a stretch on most of the artillery units in operation, and they need barrels replaced. That's a real problem and not easily solvable. Talk to people in the artillery, better still, on the ground. Next, artillery is important, but attack drones could be more important and much cheaper. So here comes a parity or even advantage to Ukraine. Then there is electronic jamming warfare, surveillance, etc., etc. So it's a war of technology. Whoever adapts and innovates faster has the upper hand. And in this war, it is the Ukrainians. For morale reasons and for structural reasons, the Russian military and technology is not the best in the world, but now it has been proven to be much weaker than it was thought before. But even if all the arguments above are ignored, the artillery angle is still weak, because if Russia had such an advantage in artillery and it was all that mattered, then please explain Belgorod events. Casualty exchange ratio is at least 2 to 1. This is point number 5, sorry. Casualty exchange ratio is at least 2 to 1, meaning that 2 Ukrainians are likely dying for every Russian. The Russians are not doing mindless frontal assaults. This is truly wishful thinking. Yes, the Russians are doing mindless frontal assaults. There is a ton of evidence from Bakhmut, and everyone I've spoken to who either has direct experience or is a military expert says the ratio is in favor of the Ukrainians by much. This is because Ukraine is a defensive force and Russia is attacking, so the ratio is in favor of Ukraine. 6. Ukraine pushed large numbers of troops into Bakhmut in a losing effort. Ukrainians are becoming desperate to conscript men. Russia has not fully mobilized yet. No, it is Russia who has dragged people into mobilization. It is Russia who has pushed large numbers of troops into Bakhmut to die for no reason, and it is Ukraine who has predominantly volunteered or taken a professional army force, even more than a year after the war. Point number 7. Russia will take the 4 oblasts they already annexed, plus, if they can, another 4 oblasts to the Dnipro River, including Odessa and Kharkiv. That's delusional. Russia has not been able to take a single regional center during this campaign, except Kherson, which was taken back. I think Russia should concentrate on keeping Belgorod and Crimea under control rather than dream about Odessa and Kharkiv. Mearsheimer believes that if the Russians are losing the war, the likelihood of nuclear use to rescue the situation is high. This argument assumes that the nuclear power always wins, but nuclear powers lose, and often, from the US in Vietnam to Russia in Afghanistan. Putin is losing his last war, and the history will prove Schneider right, Mearsheimer wrong, but at what human cost? This is David Sachs replied to that. Well, I certainly didn't misinterpret Mearsheimer. I transcribed his points almost verbatim, but I appreciate you engaging with the arguments and responding point by point. History will record who was right. Well, you're just wrong already, David Sachs. Sorry to say that. as someone says, you have been a cheerleader for any pro-Russian bit of news you can find on Twitter. Instead of trying to understand Ukrainians, you keep doubling down on false and misleading narratives, inserting terms like neocons in every post won't help. He doesn't want to help. And so I think it's good to see, firm rebuttals to these kind of points. Those points from David Sachs there, gee whiz, they're really problematic. All of them, each of those points, and even if they are direct takes from Mearsheimer, then Mearsheimer is probably wrong. Anyway, moving on to the final point, because I didn't want to make this video too long. This is not the first time I've seen this either. A smartphone saved this soldier's life. What are smartphones made of? Kevlar? Pretty decent, I'd say. Just get a bunch of smartphones and place them around your body and you'll be safe. Although you might be buzzing in the middle of the night like I don't know what. Anyway, that is good news for this chap. His life has been saved by a smartphone. Anyway, thank you so much for your support. That was just a few threads, things to talk about, think about. Thanks for your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.